Greetings, fellow humans. Today we're going to talk about the 10 most common cake mistakes made when making a cake and what we can do to fix some of them. Let's get into it. Starting a cake without a plan. So making a cake without a plan is like going to the wood shop, cutting up a bunch of pieces of wood arbitrarily and sticking them together and hoping you get a table. It just doesn't really work out that way. So what you gotta do is consider things like shape, size, ingredients, design, and other supplies. There's a lot of things to think about when you're making a cake. And of course, if you have clients already, you're already doing this step with the pricing and making sure that you're making something that the customer is happy with. If you're not working with customers though, it's still a very important step. It will save you so much time and so much anguish when it's 1 a.m. and you've forgotten an ingredient and you have to run to the store in the middle of the night and it's a nightmare. So I recommend making a list of supplies and ingredients you need, getting some references or sketching it out, anything that will help you realize sort of the steps that you need to take and it will actually illuminate kind of the limitations that you have for the cake. So it's a really important step. Forgetting to grease the pan. Guys, I've been there. It's a nightmare. You either have to rebake the entire cake or you have to patch it up because some of the cake pieces are just stuck to the pan. So what do you do if you do this? First, do not panic. Do not try to touch that cake right out of the oven. Let it cool just like any other cake. Now, once you let it cool to the point where it's kind of warm, take some saran wrap and wrap it up. This will help keep the moisture inside the cake because you are leaving it in the pan for longer, and also the steam will kind of help it separate from the edges a little bit when you try to take it out. Now, after you've let it cool down completely, then you can take off the saran wrap and then you take a spatula or a knife. I prefer a spatula because I do not like risking scratching my pan. So then I take the spatula and I gently pull in the edges towards the center. And I do it lightly at first, but then I do it pretty aggressively. And then after that, I just plop it out just like any other cake, and it comes out pretty clean. Now I will say, guys, this is pretty lucky because again, this is a 6-inch cake. So when you start getting into bigger cakes, the likelihood of that cake getting stuck increases. So I definitely recommend just try to remember to grease those cakes. Put that Crisco or whatever you use, just put it out on the oven, and that way you'll never forget. Overfilling your pans. So this can change a little bit depending on the recipe you use, guys, but generally you do not want to fill your cake pans more than halfway. If you do, you end up risking overflow, making a big mess in the oven, or overcooking the outside, burning the outside, and then having a gooey center. And so either have to kind of remake the entire cake or you have to overcook the entire cake. And maybe you can steam it up to kind of bring that moisture back, but that's just not the best case scenario, especially if you're making a cake for a customer. Now, I've really tried hard to fail in this, guys. I swear when I'm trying to make a mistake, I can't. Well, it turned out okay. I don't know what to say. The thing is, I happen to use small pans, so this result of overfilling the pan is not that big of a deal because the surface area that has to be covered is not as much. Now, when you're dealing with wider pans like 6-inch and beyond, it becomes harder to cook the center. But just because I got lucky this time doesn't mean that it will happen again, guys. So don't take this chance. Just fill the cake pans halfway. Icing a hot cake. Now, luckily, guys, making this mistake is common, but it's not that big of a deal. If you take some buttercream and you try to apply it to a cake that's still hot, it will melt. But if you see it melt, then stop putting it on there. Just give it some time. Of course, if it melts a little bit, try to scrape off the liquefied bits and then wait and come back and reapply that buttercream. Important thing to note is humidity is not our friend. It is the enemy. It is the enemy for cake making, at least for buttercream. It really can change the consistency. So you might have to wait a little bit longer than you used to for icing cakes, and also consider where are these cakes gonna go? Is it really hot in the area you are? Is it gonna be outside? If that's the case, you may want to consider a specific recipe, including crusting buttercream versus just purely buttercream. Not designating a front to your cake. Okay, I know this sounds silly, guys, and very simple, but I cannot tell you how often I forget the front of my cake and how problematic it can be. You might think it's not a problem until you start stacking some cakes and realize, oh, this was supposed to be the front. So do whatever you can to designate the front. If you're working with a very symmetrical cake where you're just using some piping around the cake, you know, the front may not matter, but maybe you need to push the cake back on the board so that you have some elements on the front. Maybe you're stacking the cake and once one of the tiers looks a little bit better on one side versus the other. Maybe you're doing a fondant pattern and you want to hide the seam in the back of the cake. All these things to consider. You want the front, obviously, to be your best side. To avoid doing this, you can just put a little sticker, decide what you want to be the front of the cake. Put a little icing that says front or like just the letter F. That will help you to remember. Overfilling your airbrush. So if you typically don't use an airbrush or you never plan to use an airbrush, then this doesn't really apply to you. But if you are thinking about using an airbrush or you use it often, there's three really main problems that can happen with airbrushes. One is you overfill them, and then when you're spraying the top of the cake, it spills onto the top. Secondly, it will spit, and that generally happens because there's some buildup of the color in the nozzle. And then also when you're getting too close to the cake and then you spray a hole in there. But fixing it is actually relatively easy. So what I tend to do is when I spill or when I spit, I take a paperless paper towel. I take a textureless paper towel and I pat it down on the area that it either sprayed or it spilled on. Gently tap it down and that will take out most of the excess. And if you blow a hole into the cake, you can also just patch that up with a little bit of icing and then smooth it down and respray it. Now when you're respraying it, you want it mostly saturated in the inner regions of the area that got messed up, and then you want to gently do it on the outer edges. Because what you're going to do is you're going to come back with your white airbrush color, and that's going to be like a blender. So you're going to go around and kind of blend that area together. To avoid spitting, make sure to clean your airbrush in between sprays by dabbing it with a paper towel gently. This will keep it from clogging. Skipping the dowels. Okay guys, structure is really important when you're making a cake. Now if you just have a 2-layer cake, a regular cake, you don't have to worry about this. Just a little bit of buttercream acting as the glue is good enough. Now if you're making anything more than 2 layers, like a 3-layer 6-inch cake, you might want to put a dowel inside. Some people don't. I still feel more comfortable if you put a dowel, or you can use those bubble tea straws. I like those the best. Now, of course, if you're doing a tiered cake, then not only do you need a dowel to go through the center of the cake, you need support. So I like to use as many dowels as the inches of the cake on top. For instance, if I have a 4-inch cake, as you see here, then I'll use 4 dowels to support it, and then I put a 4-inch board underneath the 4-inch cake. And then at the end, I drive that center dowel all the way down. Ah! This was an unexpected event. This is what my channel is called, Miscakes, everyone. Do not forget to remove the little circular holes inside the cake boards when you're stacking the cakes. I did a very quick patch-up job. I wish I had iced the cake nicely because I didn't plan to really go over icing, so I did it very quickly and pretty badly. So my patch-up job wasn't so great, but I wanted to give you an idea of what I would do, and I would just take some icing, kind of patch up those areas, and then I would just do that blending technique with the airbrush where I'd spray it the red color and I'd take some white airbrush and blend the seams. But anyways, yes guys, if you do not put the proper support for a tiered cake or multiple layers of cakes, there will be disaster. And we don't want disaster. We want success and we want cake. Delaying your prep work. So cake is very unique in the fact that it is food, so it spoils. So we have a limited time in which we can make that cake. And I usually limit myself to about 3 days before the event. So we don't really have the luxury of tons of time. But do not leave the things that you can do to the very end. Do it ahead of time. And not only will it save you stress, but fondant also needs time to dry. So if you leave it into the end, you might not actually be able to use it. So if you're making a figurine, if you're making a number, anything that has to be vertical, you're gonna have to make that ahead of time. Now, what do if you have fondant pieces, but you forgot to make them in advance? Well, there is something called Tylose powder. It's basically an agent that helps the fondant dry out a lot quicker and it makes it easier to work with. So if you need to make a number on top of a cake that's standing up, you could put the Tylose powder just like your using like cornstarch or powdered sugar. Sprinkle it in there real good, and then it should dry a lot faster. It should take about an hour, depending on what you're making, of course. These are really thin things. If you're making like large bows or figurines, I would definitely do those in advance. Do not wait until the end. Throwing away your scraps. So this is not as much of a mistake as it is a missed opportunity. So when you make a cake and you're leveling it, you might have some extra scraps, or you could have a whole cake that you made for a video and you have nothing more to do with it. So you can either freeze that for later and make cake pops, you can donate it to a homeless shelter, or you could just take it to work. So the last mistake you can make, guys, is accepting defeat. If this is something that you really care about or you really want to get good at, don't give up. It sounds corny, it sounds cheesy, but if you're feeling discouraged from the mistakes that are happening, I have made all these mistakes at least once. I probably made at least half of them in the first cake that I made, and you learn and you get better. I made one mistake already in this cake. It happens to the best of us, and if I can do it, you guys, I know you guys can do it. So if you want to do it, please do not feel discouraged. I got you. So that's all I have for today, friends. I hope this list of mistakes helps you in your cake making endeavors and convinces you to persevere. If you have any big mistakes that you've made that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Until next time, guys, happy miscaking!